The air in the high valley of Stonefall was thin and sharp, a blade against the lungs for those not born to it. For Alara, it was the only air she had ever known. It tasted of granite dust in the summer, of pine resin in the autumn, and of a deep metallic cold in the winter that promised to steal the heat from a man's bones if he stood still for too long. Now widowed and alone, the cold seemed to have found a permanent home inside her. Her husband, Jorn, had been a man of the valley, solid and quiet as the mountains that ringed their lives, and his sudden passing had left a silence that was louder than any storm. The town council had been swift. Their sympathy was a thin veneer over a core of practical cruelty. Theron Vance, the councilman whose family had owned the lumber mill for 3 generations, delivered the verdict. His voice was smooth and polished, as the furniture his mill produced, and just as hard. The home she had shared with Jorn, built from prime timber on a gentle slope overlooking the town, was tied to his position at that same mill. With him gone, her claim was void. She was to be dispossessed. They offered her a pittance, a gesture of charity that felt more like a shove out the door, and they gave her the one piece of land no one in Stonefall had ever wanted. It was a jagged parcel at the far end of the valley, a place the wind scoured clean and the sun only touched for a few grudging hours at midday. It consisted of a sliver of stony ground, barely enough for a garden, which backed up against the sheer, unyielding face of the western cliff. The Grey Jaw, the old ones called it. It was a place of geological spite. "You have until the first true snow to settle your affairs," Vance had said, not meeting her eyes. He had looked instead at her 2 horses, Boreas and Zephyr, massive draft animals whose coats shone like polished slate. They were Jorn's legacy, the last living things that connected her to him. They were also in the council's eyes a liability. A woman alone cannot manage such beasts. Sell them. It would be kinder than letting them starve or freeze. The words were a calculated barb. Vance had always coveted the horses, had offered Jorn a small fortune for them more than once. Jorn had always refused. They were not tools to him, they were partners. Now Vance saw his opportunity, cloaked in the guise of civic concern. So Alara was left with nothing but 2 magnificent horses, a collection of old tools her husband had inherited from his quarryman, great-grandfather, and a plot of land that was more vertical than horizontal. She stood before the Grey Jaw, the deed, a brittle piece of paper, feeling insignificant in her hand. The cliff face rose hundreds of feet, a solid wall of granite, and darker veins of ironstone. It was a tombstone for a forgotten giant. The ground at its base was a litter of scree and sharp-edged rocks that had broken free over millennia. Nothing grew here but wiry bitter weeds and a few defiant mosses that clung to the damp spots. What would you do if all you were left with was a rock wall and a deadline written in ice? How do you build a shelter when the very land rejects the notion of a foundation? Stay with this story and you will learn that sometimes the most formidable obstacle is also the most profound opportunity. For days, Alara did nothing. She existed in a fog of grief and despair. She would lead the horses to the thin patch of grass near the creek each morning and watch them graze their powerful bodies, a stark contrast to her own frailty. At night, they would huddle together under a makeshift lean-to of scavenged lumber, a pathetic shield against the ever-present wind that funneled down the valley. The wind was a constant voice, whispering of failure, of the coming cold, of the futility of it all. The Grey Jaw loomed over her, a silent, gray judge, impassive and eternal. Will. She felt the weight of it, the sheer, crushing tonnage of the mountain. It was the weight of her loss, the weight of the town's scorn, the weight of her impossible situation. The deadline was not some arbitrary date on a calendar, it was a force of nature. The first true snow in Stonefall was not a gentle dusting. It was a declaration of war from the sky, a siege that could last for months. To be caught without shelter was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The valley was littered with the stories of those who had underestimated the winter, their names becoming cautionary tales told around warm stoves. One afternoon, as a cold rain began to fall, turning the gray rock dark and slick, she broke. The despair became a physical thing, a pressure in her chest that stole her breath. She sank to her knees in the mud and scree, the sharp stones digging into her flesh, and she wept. She wept for Jorn, for the warmth of their small house, for the future that had been stolen from her. She wept until the tears ran cold on her face and the shivers racking her body were not from grief alone. And then something shifted. As she pushed herself up, her hand braced against the cliff face. Her palm slid over the wet stone, and through the film of water and grime she felt it. A change in texture, a subtle, almost imperceptible line, where the hard crystalline granite gave way to a softer, grittier stratum of sandstone. It was a band no more than 10 feet high, sandwiched between the harder rock above and below. Her fingers traced the seam water, barely a trickle seeped from it, following a faint fissure. She looked closer, her grief-clouded eyes focusing with a new intensity. She saw what a casual observer would miss. The seam was not uniform. It was a thick, compressed layer, a geological memory of an ancient seabed. In that moment, a different memory surfaced in her mind, sharp and clear. It was the voice of her own great-grandfather, a man she had barely known, but whose stories were woven into her family's history. He was a stonemason from the old country, a man who spoke of rock not as a dead thing, but as a living text. "Never fight the stone," his voice echoed in her memory, a phrase Jorn had often repeated when working with the valley's stubborn timber. "Read it. The stone will tell you where it is, weak it will tell you how it wishes to be shaped." A new feeling, cold and hard and clean, displaced the despair. It was not hope. Hope was a fragile thing, too easily broken. This was resolve. It was a diamond forming under pressure, a quiet, unshakable fury at the world that had tried to cast her out, and a burning determination to survive on her own terms. The gray jaw was not a tombstone. It was a foundation. She would not build a barn. Building required lumber she did not have, a flat space that did not exist, and time that was running out. Building a barn in the open would be a fool's errand, a wooden box waiting to be crushed by the wind and the snow. The valley broke things that stood against it. She would not build. She would carve. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious, born of desperation and ancestral memory. She would hollow out a shelter from the sandstone seam, creating a stable within the cliff itself. A stable that could not be blown down, could not be buried, could not be broken. A stable that would draw its strength and its warmth from the mountain's heart. The next morning, the town saw a different Alara. The haze of grief was gone, replaced by a focused intensity that was almost unnerving. She walked to the small general store, its shelves sparsely stocked, but its owner, Silas, a man of few words and keen eyes. Wide. She bought lamp oil, whetstones, and a length of sturdy rope. She paid with the last of the council's pittance. Silas watched her, his gaze lingering on the calluses already forming on her hands. He said nothing, but he added a small bag of dried beans and a block of salt to her parcel without charge. She spent 2 days just observing. She watched the sun's path across the sky, noting where the light lingered and where the shadows fell. She studied the flow of water down the cliff face during a brief shower, mapping the fissures and weaknesses it revealed. She used a bucket and rope to measure the height of the sandstone seam precisely. She was no longer a victim of the landscape, she was its student. Then the work began. She retrieved Jorn's old tools from the small chest, where they were kept wrapped in oiled cloth. There was a heavy sledgehammer with a handle worn smooth by generations of hands. There were star drills of hardened steel, a set of iron wedges, a long crowbar, and a broad-bladed pickaxe. They felt impossibly heavy, tools meant for a man's strength. But as she held them, she felt the connection to the past, to the quarrymen and masons in her bloodline. Their knowledge felt like a ghost standing at her shoulder, guiding her hands. She started at the base of the seam, using the pickaxe to clear away the loose scree and expose the solid rock. The sound of steel on stone was a sharp, percussive shock in the valley's silence. It was a sound of defiance. It was that sound that drew Theron Vance. He rode up on his fine high-stepping gelding, a stark contrast to her powerful but plain draft horses. He watched her for a long moment, a smirk playing on his lips as he took in the scene. The lone woman, the massive cliff, the small pile of chipped rock at her feet. "Elara," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mocking pity, "what is this foolishness? Are you trying to quarry stone for your own grave marker? It will be a fitting monument to your stubbornness." She did not stop her work. She swung the pickaxe, the impact jarring her arms, and pried another chunk of weathered stone loose. She straightened, breathing heavily, and finally looked at him. Her face was smudged with dust, her hands already raw. "I am building a stable, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice low and even, without a trace of the emotion he was trying to provoke. Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked from the cliff face to the sky, and back again, as if sharing a joke with the universe. "A stable in the rock, woman? You have lost your senses. The winter will seal you and your beasts in a stone coffin. This is madness." "It is a plan," she replied, turning back to her work. "It is a tomb," he scoffed. "Sell the horses. I will give you a fair price." "More than fair. Take the money and go to a warmer town, a place for a grieving widow. This valley is no place for you now." She paused again, resting the pickaxe head on the ground. She looked at Boreas and Zephyr, who stood watching nearby, their breath misting in the cooling air. Then she looked back at Vance, her eyes as gray and hard as the granite above her. "They are not for sale," she said. It was a final, quiet declaration. Vance's face tightened, the pretense of concern falling away to reveal the raw arrogance beneath. "Then freeze!" he spat. He wheeled his horse around, kicking up a spray of gravel, and rode off. His laughter, thin and cruel, drifted back on the wind, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the valley. His scorn did not wound her. It hardened her. It was fuel for the fire that now burned in her belly. Every mocking word, every pitying glance from the townspeople who passed on the distant track became another swing of the hammer, another inch of progress into the stone. The days that followed blurred into a grueling rhythm of labor. Dawn would find her at the cliff face, her breath pluming, her muscles aching from the day before. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on both stone and body. She would take a star drill, hold it against the sandstone, and begin the slow punishing process of hammering. The ring of steel on steel became the valley's new heartbeat. Tap, 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 a rhythmic pulse of sheer will, and another, and another. Each hole was a small victory, a purchase against the mountain's indifference. Once a series of holes was drilled, she would drive in the iron wedges. Then came the sledgehammer. Lifting the heavy hammer was a trial in itself. She learned to use her whole body, her legs, her core, channeling all her strength and grief and anger into each swing. The booming impact echoed across the valley floor. Sometimes a satisfying crack would announce a split in the rock. Other times there was just a dull thud, the stone refusing to yield. Slowly, agonizingly, she carved out an opening. First a shallow alcove, then a deepening cavity. The sandstone was softer than the granite, but it was still stone. It fought her for every inch. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic work, were shredded. They bled, blistered, and then hardened into thick, leathery calluses. Her back screamed in protest. Her shoulders felt as if they were being pulled from their sockets. Every night she would collapse onto her simple cot in the lean-to, too exhausted to eat, and fall into a dreamless sleep that was more like a temporary death. But something was happening to her. As the hole in the cliff grew, she grew stronger. The grueling labor burned away the soft edges of her grief, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. Her body, once weary with sorrow, became lean and powerful. The muscles in her arms and back coiled like thick rope. She learned the language of the stone, could feel its grain, predict its fractures. She was not just digging a hole, she was shaping a space, working in partnership with the mountain. She was not merely building a structure, she was becoming a part of the landscape herself. The design was guided by her great-grandfather's remembered wisdom. The entrance was angled away from the prevailing wind, creating a natural barrier against the drafts that were the bane of every barn in Stonefall. She carved the opening just wide enough for the horses to pass through comfortably, one at a time. Inside, she sloped the floor gently towards the entrance, carving a shallow channel along one side for drainage. She understood that damp was as great an enemy as the cold. High on the back wall, she spent a week painstakingly drilling a narrow ventilation shaft upwards, following a natural fissure until it emerged on a small ledge high above. It was a chimney for stale air and moisture, ensuring the air inside would remain fresh and dry. The townspeople, when they saw her toiling, shook their heads. They saw a woman digging her own grave. They did not see the meticulous engineering, the deep understanding of natural forces at play. As the first hints of winter began to color the air, a change occurred in the town's perception. The initial mockery from the chorus of doubters began to be tinged with a grudging curiosity. The sheer scale of her labor was impossible to ignore. The growing cavern in the Grey Jaw was a testament to a will they could not comprehend. One evening, as dusk painted the valley in shades of purple and gray, Silas from the general store made his way to her camp. He carried a lantern and a small heavy sack. He did not say a word, just watched as she levered a massive slab of sandstone out of the cavern with the crowbar, her movements economical and powerful. He set the sack down. "More oil for your lamps," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and I brought some cured pork. You're burning more fuel than you're taking in." Ilara straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty arm. She looked at the sack, then at him. His face was weathered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a glimmer of something she had not seen from anyone else in weeks. It was respect. "I cannot pay you for this yet, Silas," she said. He just nodded. "The account is open. The winter is coming on fast. You'll need your strength." He gave a single, sharp nod towards the cavern. "My grandfather built his root cellar in much the same way. Dug it out of the hillside behind his house. He said the earth has a deep warmth the sun can't match. It was the first crack in the wall of public disbelief. A small gesture, a few quiet words, but to Ilara it felt like a buttress placed against her soul." She was not entirely alone. The work intensified. The cavity was now large enough to be called a room. It was over 20 feet deep and wide enough for 2 stalls with a small passage between them. The stone ceiling was low and arched, a shape of immense strength. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and shattered rock. It was a raw primordial space, but it felt safe. It felt solid. The wind could howl outside, but in here there was only a profound silence. She began the finishing work. She used a smaller hammer and chisel to smooth the rough walls of the stalls, removing any sharp projections. She lined the floor of each stall with sand from the creek bed, and then, with a thick layer of dried pine needles she had spent weeks gathering. Finally, she used the last of her scavenged lumber to construct simple hay mangers and a sturdy gate for the entrance. The day she finished, the sky was the color of lead. The air was unnaturally still heavy, with a sense of impending violence. The birds were gone. The squirrels had vanished. The valley was holding its breath. The old-timers in Stonefall saw the signs and laid in extra wood, their faces grim. They spoke in hushed tones of the winter of '78, a blizzard that had buried the town for a month. This, they whispered, felt worse. Alara led Boreas and Zephyr to the entrance of the cavern. They hesitated, sniffing at the strange, dark opening. The smell of the stone was alien to them. She spoke to them in low, soothing tones, the way Jorn always had. She walked inside, holding a small handful of oats. After a moment, Boreas, the bolder of the two, lowered his massive head and followed her in. Zephyr, trusting his companion, followed a second later. They stood inside, their ears twitching, taking in the strange acoustics, the enclosed space. The silence seemed to calm them. She filled their mangers with hay, and the familiar comforting sound of their chewing filled the cavern. She closed the heavy wooden gate, slid the thick bar into place, and stood for a moment in the dim, lantern-lit space. Outside, the first snowflake fell. Then another. And another. What is the true test of an idea? Is it the approval of a committee, the praise of one's peers, or the silent, impartial judgment of the natural world? We now stand on the precipice of that judgment where conventional wisdom and forgotten knowledge will face the same unpitying storm. Which do you believe will endure? The storm did not arrive. It descended. It was not a weather event. It was an invading army. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a shrieking physical presence. It tore at the roofs of houses, ripped shutters from their hinges, and sent loose objects cartwheeling into the growing gloom. Then the snow came, not as flakes, but as a solid, blinding wall of white that erased the world. Town of Stonefall hunkered down, families gathered around their stoves, feeding them a constant diet of precious firewood. The wind found every crack and seam in their well-built wooden homes, and the cold seeped in like a tide. The sounds of the storm were terrifying. The roar of the wind, the groaning of timber under stress, the occasional sharp crack of a frozen tree limb giving way. In his large, modern house, Theron Vance felt a smug sense of security. Said, his barn was the newest in the valley, a testament to his family's wealth and foresight. It was built with the finest timber from his own mill, with a steep pitched roof designed by an architect from the city. His prize-winning stallion, a beast of immense value and ego, was safe within its walls. Vance listened to the storm and smiled, thinking of the foolish woman in her stone hole. He imagined her frozen, her horses dead, a grim but necessary lesson in humility. The narrative of that night would be told for generations. A story of two different worlds existing side by side in the same valley. In the town, the struggle was desperate. The snow began to accumulate with terrifying speed. It was not light and fluffy, it was wet and heavy, the kind the old-timers called cement snow. An hour into the storm, the first roof gave way. The livery stable, its old beams unequal to the task. The sound of its collapse was a thunderclap that was barely audible over the wind. But the news spread like a chill through the beleaguered townsfolk. By midnight, the snow was 3 feet deep and piling into monstrous drifts. The wind sculpted it, packing it hard against the eastern walls of buildings. The pressure was immense. The first cries of alarm came from the Miller farmstead, where the roof of their cow barn had sagged and then splintered, trapping their herd. Then another barn went and another. The structures built to withstand a normal Stonefall winter were failing under the assault of a generational storm. They were fighting the weight of the sky, and they were losing. Inside Theron Vance's state-of-the-art barn, things were no better. The wind hammered at the wide double doors, and fine stinging snow blasted through the eaves. The stallion, terrified by the noise and the shaking of the structure, kicked frantically at its stall. A low groaning sound started, the protest of massive beams under a load they were never designed to bear. Vance, bundled in his warmest coat, fought his way to the barn to check on his investment, and the fear that gripped him was colder than the wind. He could see the ridgepole bowing downwards in the lantern light. The barn was dying. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, inside the gray jaw, a different reality existed. Ilara sat on a small stool, a single lantern casting a warm, steady glow on the stone walls. The only sounds were the soft munching of the horses and their occasional deep contented sigh. Boreas and Zephyr stood calmly in their stalls. Insulated from the storm's fury, they could not hear the wind. They could not feel the cold. The mountain surrounded them, its immense silent mass absorbing the storm's rage without a tremor. The air in the stable was cool but not cold. The deep geothermal heat of the earth itself radiated slowly from the stone, creating a constant, stable temperature. The body heat of the two massive horses was contained within the space, adding to the ambient warmth. The ingenious ventilation shaft did its work, drawing the moisture from their breath up and out, keeping the air crisp and dry. There was no draft, no shudder, no sense of a battle being waged. The storm was not a threat. It was an irrelevance. Ilara was not fighting the blizzard. She was simply ignoring it. She had not built a wall to keep the winter out. She had stepped inside a wall that had always been there. It was the profound difference between opposition and harmony. While the rest of the valley was burning through its resources in a desperate losing battle against nature, Ilara was at peace, sheltered within it. She checked the hay, ensured the water trough was free of ice, and then curled up under a thick wool blanket on a bed of hay, listening to the quiet breathing of her companions. She slept, warm and secure, as the storm raged on. The blizzard lasted for 2 full days and nights. When it finally broke, the world was remade. A profound, ringing silence fell over the valley, the silence of a world buried under a blanket of white 10 feet deep. The sun rose on a landscape of surreal flowing shapes. The town of Stonefall was a ruin field. The devastation was catastrophic. Not a single barn built in the traditional way had survived intact. Most had collapsed completely, their splintered timbers sticking up from the snow like the ribs of dead animals. The loss of livestock was devastating. Even many of the houses were damaged, their porches torn away, their roofs leaking from the immense weight of the snow. Theron Vance's magnificent barn was a heap of shattered lumber. His prize stallion lay dead beneath the wreckage. He stood before the ruin of his pride, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. All his money, all his modern designs, all his confidence had been crushed as easily as an eggshell. In the town, the first priority was survival. People began the back-breaking work of digging out, checking on neighbors, counting their losses. It was amidst this grim accounting that a thought surfaced in the mind of Silas, the store owner. He thought of Ilara. No one had seen her. Our plot of land was at the far end of the valley where the drifts would be deepest. The consensus was grim. If the strongest barns in Stonefall had been destroyed, what chance did a lone woman and a lean-to have? Her mad project of digging into the cliff was surely a frozen tomb by now. It was a tragedy, they murmured, but an expected one. Silas, however, remembered the look in her eyes. He remembered the quiet competence of her work. He fashioned a pair of rough snowshoes, and against the advice of his neighbors, began the long, arduous trek to the Grey Jaw. The journey took him 2 hours. The snow was so deep, it was like wading through a frozen sea. As he approached her land, his heart sank. There was nothing. The lean-to was gone, obliterated. The entire area was a smooth, sculpted drift, piled high against the cliff face. There was no sign of life. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, offering a silent prayer for the stubborn woman. He was about to turn back when he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible wisp of vapor, rising from what looked like a small hole in the snowdrift. Curiosity overriding his despair, he floundered closer. The hole was the top of her ventilation shaft. And the vapor was the warm, moist air from within. He stared at it, uncomprehending. He shouted her name, his voice swallowed by the vast white silence. Ilara! For a moment there was no answer. Then the snow near the base of the cliff shifted. A wooden gate, caked in white, was pushed outwards, and Ilara emerged, blinking in the sudden, blinding glare of the sun on the snow. She was wearing her simple wool coat. Her face was flushed with warmth, and she looked not like a survivor, but like someone who had just woken from a restful sleep. Silas stared, speechless. He saw past her into the dim opening. He saw the massive, calm shapes of Boreas and Zephyr, alive and well. He stumbled forward, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with the devastation he had left behind. He stepped inside. The warmth was the first thing that struck him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a wood stove, but a deep, gentle warmth that seemed to rise from the very ground. The air was fresh and smelled of clean hay and healthy animals. It was a pocket of impossible serenity, a sanctuary carved from the heart of the storm's fury. He looked at the smooth stone walls, the arched ceiling, the clever design of the stalls, and the vent. He looked at the horses, who regarded him with placid curiosity. He looked at Ilara, who stood watching him with her quiet, steady gaze. He finally found his voice a choked whisper. "How?" Ilara gestured to the stone walls around them, a simple, sweeping motion that encompassed the entire mountain. "The valley wind breaks what stands against it," she said, her voice as calm and solid as the rock. "It cannot break what is already a part of the stone." It was the simple, for profound principle behind her success. A truth the valley had always known, but that the town, in its rush to build and conquer, had forgotten. By midday, Theron Vance, leading a small party of men to recover the body, arrived at the scene. He saw Silas. He saw Ilara alive. He saw her horses peacefully munching hay at the entrance to their impossible stable. He saw all of this standing before the wreckage of his own ambition and the frozen corpse of his prized horse. The sight broke him. The public humiliation was absolute. His authority, built on a foundation of wealth and conventional wisdom, crumbled into dust. He turned without a word, his face ashen, and trudged back towards the ruined town. He would leave Stonefall within the month, a man defeated not by a rival, but by a truth he had refused to see. The story of Ilara's stable spread through Stonefall and then through the surrounding valleys like a legend. In the aftermath of the great blizzard, with the town facing a long, hard recovery, they did not turn to the council or the wealthy mill owner. They turned to the quiet widow they had scorned. They came to her, first one by one, then in small groups. They came, not with pity or charity, but with a humbled, desperate curiosity. They asked to see the stable. She showed them. They touched the stone walls, felt the impossible warmth, and listened as she explained the simple, ancient principles of working with the earth, not against it. She became their teacher. She taught them how to read the stone, to find the seams of softer rock. She showed them how to dig root cellars that would never freeze, workshops that were cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and even small, partial dwellings built into the hillsides. She shared the forgotten wisdom of her ancestors freely, asking for nothing in return. The town of Stonefall began to transform. The people did not abandon their timber houses, but they augmented them. They dug deep, insulated cellars. They built stone foundations that worked with the contours of the land. They learned to angle their new structures to deflect the wind. They became more resilient, more self-sufficient, a community that understood its environment in a way it never had before. Their relationship with the valley shifted from one of conflict to one of cautious, respectful partnership. Years passed. Ilara lived a long and quiet life. She never remarried, but she was never alone. She was the matriarch of the valley, the custodian of its deepest wisdom. Boreas and Zephyr lived to a ripe old age, serving as a constant, living reminder of the winter that had changed everything. The stable she had carved into the gray jaw became a local landmark, a monument to resilience and ingenuity. Travelers would come to see it, to hear the story of the woman who had sheltered in the mountain's heart. She was eventually laid to rest on a small rise overlooking her work, a simple stone marker, the only tribute she would have wanted. But her true legacy was in the fabric of the town itself, in the stone-walled cellars full of food, in the sturdy homes that no longer feared the winter wind, and in the hard-won knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. The story of Alara serves as a timeless reminder. It teaches us that true strength is often found not in loud declarations or impressive facades, but in quiet, patient work. It shows that the greatest wisdom is sometimes hidden in the past, dismissed as primitive or foolish by a world enamored with its own cleverness. And it proves, beyond any doubt, that there is profound value in what has been discarded, and that the most unyielding obstacle can, with the right perspective, become the most steadfast and reliable shelter.